On the left side of the screen, an archived ledger from 1901. It is a legal contract handing a British corporation absolute control over a territory the size of Texas. On the right, a frantic diplomatic telegram dated 1935. The message is a geopolitical autopsy. The sovereign entity known as Persia is officially declared dead. We are looking at the paper trail of a nation that faked its own death, erasing its ancient name from the map just to escape a corporate stranglehold. You might think this is just dusty history, a footnote from a forgotten empire. You would be dead wrong. Right now, modern transnational monopolies are deploying the exact same legal frameworks to patent the rainwater you drink and the genetic code of the seeds you plant. If you do not understand the architecture of these sovereign loopholes, you are completely blind to the invisible ironclad contracts currently quietly taking ownership of your personal data, your assets, and your future. I'm going to pull back the curtain on the ultimate geopolitical hack of the 20th century. We are tearing down the romanticized, cinematic illusions of Middle Eastern history. Forget the spies and the cavalry charges. The real shadow war was fought with ink, jurisdiction, and filing cabinets. We will trace the cold, hard legal paperwork that actually dictates global survival, decoding a masterstroke of administrative sabotage that paralyzed a global superpower without firing a single bullet. The air in this windowless archive room is heavy with the smell of decaying cellulose. A microfilm projector whirs to life, casting a harsh white rectangle against the wall. To the forensic accountant, the fading ink on this document is not a historical artifact. It is a crime scene. We are looking at the original manuscript of the Darcy concession. Red marker lines aggressively highlight the specific, buried clauses that legally amputated the subterranean wealth of an entire civilization. The date at the top of the parchment is 1901. In a moment of spectacular short-sightedness, the ruling Shah of Persia pressed his royal seal to this unprecedented transfer of sovereign wealth. The geographic coordinates outline an exclusive, monopolistic right to prospect, extract, and sell petroleum across an astonishing 480,000 square miles. To put that into perspective, the target area was significantly larger than the entire state of Texas. Through the weary eyes of the financial auditor, this is not a negotiation. It is an unconditional surrender masked as commerce. The paper trail reveals a foreign private entity locking down the geological blood of a nation before the local population even understood its value. Every barrel of crude oil waiting beneath the desert sand was legally signed away by a monarch who traded a multi-trillion-dollar monopoly for a temporary influx of cash to fund his lavish European vacations. But the most lethal weapon in this contract is hidden in the timeline. The concession was legally cemented for a duration of 60 years. This was an ironclad, multi-generational trap carefully engineered by British solicitors. By signing this document, the Shah did not just bankrupt his own administration. He legally shackled his children, his grandchildren, and unborn millions to a foreign corporate master. The legal architecture was flawless, designed to withstand any local political upheaval. The motive is always buried in the margins. In exchange for the absolute right to drain the earth, the Persian treasury was promised a mere 16% of net profits. The critical word here is net. To an experienced forensic accountant, tying national revenue to net profits is a glaring red flag. It allowed the corporation's bookkeepers in London to deploy aggressive, creative accounting, artificially inflating operational costs to ensure the paper profits remained as close to zero as possible. This single clause initiated the most systematic capital hemorrhage in modern history. The ledgers show millions of gallons of heavy crude flowing out of the ports, fueling foreign dreadnoughts and industrial booms, while the host nation received literal pennies on the dollar. The anomaly is staggering. We have a sovereign state acting as the primary energy donor for a global empire, yet its own treasury is bleeding out. The paper trail proves the theft was entirely legal, sanctioned by international law. You have to ask yourself, who actually engineered this heist? This flawless corporate snare was not drafted by a shadowy government agency or a brilliant general. The beneficiary on the charter was a private citizen, a wealthy British socialite named William Knox Darcy. He never even set foot in the Middle East to see the empire he purchased. He simply dispatched his lawyers and his geologists, armed with a fountain pen and a predatory understanding of contract law. We are looking at the precise moment a country was sold for scrap. The signature at the bottom of the Darcy concession is the ultimate piece of evidence. It represents how one desperate, bankrupt monarch pawned the entire geopolitical future of his nation to a foreign investor. The ink on this page set the stage for a century of coups, assassinations, and economic warfare. It transformed a vast, ancient civilization into a massive, heavily guarded corporate extraction zone. The anomaly we are investigating is how you break an unbreakable contract. According to the international courts in Geneva, the document was sacred. If the Persian government tried to cancel it, they would face the full, devastating wrath of the British Royal Navy. They were trapped in a paradox, legally bound to their own exploitation, mathematically guaranteed to go bankrupt, and militarily incapable of fighting back. The legal code itself was the prison holding them captive. So, how does a captive nation break an airtight legal contract backed by the most powerful military on the planet? If you cannot afford to pay the penalty, and you cannot survive a direct war, there is only one option left in the forensic playbook. You have to find a vulnerability in the dictionary. You have to locate the ghost in the machine of international law. To escape the signature that sold a country, you have to completely erase the identity of the victim who signed it. To find that vulnerability in the dictionary, we first need to understand the true scale of the adversary. We have to follow the money from that initial, flawed legal document directly into the bank accounts of the ultimate beneficiary. The paper trail does not end with a wealthy socialite counting dividends in a London mansion. The transaction log leads us straight to the military-industrial complex, specifically the British Admiralty. To the observer standing in the freezing fog of the British shipyards in the early 20th century, the shift in global power is physically visible. You look to the left and you see the massive, soot-stained hulls of the old, coal-powered dreadnoughts. You look to the right, and the dry docks are filled with the sleek, clean lines of new, oil-fired battleships. This is not just a technological upgrade. This is the physical manifestation of a military addiction. As we look at this supply chain, a glaring strategic anomaly emerges. Why would an island nation, sitting on some of the largest, most secure coal reserves on the planet, suddenly decide to source its primary military fuel from a desert thousands of miles away? The logistics of this decision are a nightmare. It requires securing maritime choke points across the entire globe just to keep the naval engines running and the empire intact. The answer is found in the brutal physics of naval warfare and a rapidly ticking geopolitical clock. In 1914, the arms race with the German Empire is reaching a critical threshold. The survival of the British Empire depends entirely on maintaining absolute supremacy over the oceans. Through the eyes of the Naval Command, the old, reliable domestic coal infrastructure is suddenly viewed as a fatal liability on the battlefield. Coal requires hundreds of exhausted men shoveling fuel into roaring furnaces deep within the ship. It produces thick black smoke that acts as a beacon, alerting enemy fleets to your exact coordinates from miles away. It is inefficient, heavy, and slow. The naval strategists calculate that staying with domestic fuel mathematically guarantees defeat. They need an energy source with a higher energy density, regardless of the geographic risk. This is the exact moment the corporate contract mutates into a matter of absolute national security. Winston Churchill, serving as the First Lord of the Admiralty, reviews the ballistics and engine data. He makes a fateful, unilateral decision to convert the entire British Navy from Welsh coal to foreign crude oil. It is a calculated, desperate gamble that permanently alters the trajectory of global geopolitics and modern warfare. The tactical advantages of crude oil are immediate and devastating. Oil burns hotter and cleaner. It allows a warship to reach its maximum speed in a fraction of the time, outmaneuvering any coal-powered enemy vessel. It extends the operational range and frees up critical storage space for heavier artillery. But this technological leap creates a massive, unprecedented strategic vulnerability for the homeland. By adopting oil, the British Admiralty has effectively outsourced its naval superiority to a foreign extraction zone. The British Isles do not produce a single drop of crude. If the pipelines in the Middle East are severed, or if a local monarch suddenly decides to tear up a piece of paper, the most powerful armada on Earth becomes a floating collection of scrap metal. The empire is entirely exposed to a supply chain disruption. You do not leave the survival of a global empire resting on the fragile clauses of a private commercial agreement. When we pull the financial records from the period, we find a highly classified transaction designed to mitigate this exact vulnerability. The government cannot rely on the whims of private shareholders to secure their critical infrastructure. They execute a silent, bureaucratic takeover right in the middle of London. The ledgers reveal that the British government quietly purchased a 51% controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. They did not use military force. They used a fountain pen and a massive injection of capital to buy the boardroom. The corporate entity, originally founded by a private speculator, is instantly transformed into a vital, fully funded organ of the state apparatus. This stealth acquisition completely erases the line between private enterprise and state power. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company is no longer a mere corporation seeking quarterly profits for its investors. It is now a heavily armed extension of the British government, operating under the direct protection of the Royal Navy. The corporate mandate is now entirely synchronized with imperial survival and global dominance. Reviewing the operational protocols, the shift in the company's behavior is chilling. The board of directors is now directly answering to military intelligence and the treasury. They are authorized to use whatever means necessary to secure the flow of crude. The host nation is no longer dealing with aggressive businessmen. They are dealing with an occupying force disguised as a corporate board of directors. The Darcy concession is no longer just an exploitative financial document. It is the legal justification for the wholesale extraction of the Earth's blood to feed a war machine. As we trace the shipping lanes back to the source, we are about to see what this hybrid corporate military beast looks like on the ground. We are heading into the blistering heat of the world's largest industrial anomaly to witness the true cost of this fuel. We leave the mahogany desks of Whitehall and follow the capital flow directly to Ground Zero. I'm tracking the expenditure reports from 1930, and the paper trail leads straight into a literal inferno. The documents detail the construction of the Abadan refinery. On paper, it is a masterclass in industrial logistics. In reality, it is a sprawling nightmare of iron pipes and choking smokestacks, deliberately erected on an isolated, hostile mudflat. The ledgers under my desk lamp cannot capture the physical brutality of this operation, but the localized casualty reports certainly try. I'm looking at thermal records indicating sustained working conditions of 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat waves distort the horizon, turning the facility into a mirage of soot and steel. This is where the abstract concept of imperial energy security translates into raw, physical extraction. But as I cross-reference the payroll archives with territorial maps, a massive jurisdictional anomaly emerges. You are looking at a corporate entity that is suddenly exhibiting all the behavioral markers of a sovereign invader. The question is not how they extracted the oil, but how they managed to completely bypass the host government. I am staring at the financial blueprint of a shadow state, built entirely within the borders of a recognized nation. Look closely at the corporate zoning documents. This is the anatomy of a parasitic architecture. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company did not just build a factory. They constructed an entirely autonomous, closed-loop ecosystem. The host nation had no jurisdiction here. If you were a local inspector, you did not cross the perimeter. The corporation effectively severed this territory from the rest of the country, creating a black box of extraction where standard laws no longer applied. The production metrics from the 1930s are simply staggering. Within a few short years, the Abadan facility metastasized into the largest oil refinery on the face of the planet. I'm tracing the shipping manifests, millions upon millions of barrels of refined crude, pumped continuously into the bellies of British naval dreadnoughts and commercial tankers. The scale of the output was so vast, it single-handedly dictated the global market price of energy. Yet when I audit the local reinvestment column, the ledger is practically blank. The massive wealth generated by this facility instantly vanished offshore. The company engineered a financial vacuum, ensuring that the sheer velocity of capital leaving the port never circulated within the local economy. It is a textbook extraction protocol. You maximize the outflow of high-value resources while strictly minimizing the infrastructural footprint left behind for the native population. The human cost of this ledger is meticulously documented in the payroll archives. I have isolated the wage distribution for the native workforce. Persian laborers, physically covered in toxic crude oil and breathing sulfur all day, earned the equivalent of exactly 50 cents for a 12-hour shift. This is not a wage. It is a meticulously calculated starvation allowance, designed to keep the workforce entirely dependent on the next day of labor, just to survive the week. The geographical segregation is mapped out right here in the company blueprints. While British managers retreated to heavily guarded, air-conditioned bungalows with manicured lawns, the local laborers were forced into peripheral shanty towns. I'm looking at sanitation reports from these zones. No running water, no electricity, no basic sewage infrastructure. The corporation deliberately engineered poverty to maintain absolute leverage over its primary labor asset. This was a highly structured, racially stratified hierarchy. The company documents explicitly divide the workforce into categorized tiers, specifically to prevent any unified labor organization. If you keep the workers divided, desperate, and living in squalor, they cannot strike. It is a cynical, mathematical approach to human resources, ensuring that the engine of the largest refinery on Earth never stalls due to something as trivial as a demand for basic human rights. But the ultimate proof of this shadow state lies in the security protocols. A standard oil company hires guards. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company operated a fully militarized private police force. I am reading the incident reports. This corporate militia answered to no local authority. They enforced their own laws, suppressed dissent with extreme prejudice, and maintained absolute control over the extraction zone. The corporation had successfully monopolized the use of violence. To insulate this operation from the capital city of Tehran, the company weaponized its slush funds. The accounting books reveal systematic, heavy payouts classified as local administrative fees. In reality, these were direct bribes paid to regional tribal leaders. The corporation systematically purchased the loyalty of local warlords, funding proxy armies to deliberately undermine and ignore the authority of the Central Persian government. It was an orchestrated destabilization. You are witnessing the perfect execution of a hostile corporate takeover, not of a rival business, but of a sovereign region. By controlling the security apparatus and buying off the regional power brokers, the company established a legally impenetrable hostile corporate zone on foreign soil. The central government in Tehran was reduced to a mere spectator, watching helplessly as the lifeblood of their country was systematically drained from behind a wall of private mercenaries. This level of systemic exploitation is mathematically unsustainable. When you review the profit margins alongside the rising desperation of the host nation, you realize a collision is inevitable. The tension in these ledgers is building toward a catastrophic failure point. The corporation believed their paper contracts made them invincible, but they failed to calculate the explosive threshold of national humiliation. A breaking point is coming, and it will ignite the entire board. The explosive threshold we anticipated is not found on a battlefield, but in the sterile silence of a royal treasury room in Tehran. Look at the balance sheets on this decaying mahogany desk. While the Abadan refinery churns out record-breaking volumes of crude oil, the sovereign accounts of the nation hosting it are bleeding dry. The math here is entirely broken. A nation is drowning in debt, while its own soil produces unimaginable wealth. Through the eyes of a forensic auditor, this is a crime scene hidden in plain sight. The monarch paces the lavish but deteriorating office, aggressively reviewing the collapsing financial ledgers. He slams a heavy report onto the desk. The anomaly is glaring. The volume of exported petroleum is steadily climbing, yet the revenue deposited into the national treasury is plunging into an abyss. How does a monopoly pump more product but pay less money? To find the killer, you follow the paper trail. I am reviewing the corporate filings from 1932, right in the suffocating grip of the Great Depression. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company did not just suffer a market downturn, they weaponized it. They deployed a labyrinth of subsidiary entities and ghost corporations to systematically launder their true profit margins. It is a masterclass in predatory accounting designed to starve the host. The corporate architecture is intentionally designed to be an impenetrable maze. By routing their international sales through a series of offshore holding companies, the syndicate effectively sold the oil to themselves at artificially deflated prices. The real profits were parked safely in London, entirely shielded from the 16% royalty agreement. They legally erased the revenue before the local government could even calculate its share. The physical ledgers tell a story of absolute financial slaughter. I am looking at the year-over-year revenue statements. Despite the physical extraction of oil actively increasing across the desert facilities, the royalty payments issued to the sovereign government collapsed. In a single fiscal year, the payouts dropped by an astonishing 76%. This is not an accounting error or a market fluctuation. This is a deliberate economic strangulation. Put yourself in the position of the sovereign ruler staring at these doctored numbers. The state infrastructure is crumbling, the treasury is functionally bankrupt, and the public humiliation is becoming absolute. The entire nation is tethered to a parasitic contract that is legally binding them to their own starvation. The 60-year timeline of the Darcy concession is no longer just a bad deal. It is a meticulously calculated death sentence. The forensic evidence shows that logic inevitably gives way to visceral action when a system is this rigged. The monarch picks up the original, bound copy of the 1921 concession. The camera tracks his hand as he walks across the Persian rugs and violently throws the document into a burning fireplace. The heavy parchment curls and turns to ash. He's not just destroying paper. He is attempting to incinerate the legal chains of an empire. This single act of defiance triggers a catastrophic chain reaction across the global board. Faced with total insolvency and a shattered mandate, the ruler unilaterally cancels the Darcy concession. He simply declares the most lucrative corporate monopoly on earth null and void. By terminating the agreement outside of any recognized international tribunal, he instantly elevates a contract dispute into a full-scale geopolitical crisis. The smoke rising from that fireplace reaches London faster than any telegraph. I'm tracking the panic erupting across the floors of the British Admiralty and the corporate boardrooms. The entire naval superiority of the British Empire, heavily reliant on the fuel flowing from Abadan, is suddenly completely illegitimate. The foundational document that authorized their presence has been unilaterally erased by the host nation. From an investigator's perspective, a cancelled contract creates a terrifying jurisdictional void. The company is now operating an industrial empire on foreign soil without a single shred of legal cover. Every barrel of crude oil they extract is suddenly classified as stolen property. The local workforce, already pushed to the brink of rebellion, now watches their sovereign leader openly defy the invisible corporate masters. The illusion of control is shattering. This is the fundamental danger of building an empire on legal fiction. The monopoly relied on the assumption that the host nation would quietly submit to its own systematic robbery. They engineered an elaborate financial machine to siphon the wealth, but they failed to factor in the explosive volatility of human desperation. You can manipulate the ledgers, but you cannot permanently mandate compliance from a starving population. But the syndicate is not going to simply pack up their refineries and walk away from the most strategic energy asset on the planet. I'm reviewing the emergency protocols activated in Whitehall. The corporate executives are seamlessly merging back into the state military apparatus. When the paperwork burns, the velvet glove comes off, and the iron fist of imperial diplomacy prepares to strike back with devastating, formalized precision. The unilateral cancellation was a necessary act of survival, but it was also a tactical miscalculation. You do not simply tear up a contract owned by the largest naval superpower in existence without triggering a massive retaliation. The battlefield is about to shift from the dusty treasury rooms of Tehran to the cold, unforgiving architecture of international law. The host nation has made its move, and now the empire is preparing its legal execution. The ashes of the Darcy concession have barely cooled in Tehran, but the smoke leads us directly to the real battlefield. I am pulling the transcripts from the League of Nations archives in Geneva. The air in this library is thick with the dust of dead empires and broken treaties. We are leaving the physical sabotage of the oil fields to examine the cold, bureaucratic machinery of international law. The host nation made its move, and now the empire strikes back with paper and steel. You cannot simply burn a sovereign contract without triggering the protocol of imperial retaliation. I'm looking at the deployment logs from the British Admiralty. The immediate response is not negotiation. It is a show of overwhelming kinetic force. Warships are immediately dispatched to the Persian Gulf. This is textbook gunboat diplomacy. The message is not written in ink, but in the heavy caliber of naval artillery aimed directly at the vulnerable coastline. But military intimidation is too crude for the 20th century. You need a legally defensible alibi to occupy a sovereign state. To find the true motive, I am shifting focus from the gunboats to a cavernous, echoing hall in Switzerland. Through the eyes of the legal historian, I see British lawyers in immaculate suits sitting across a highly polished wooden table from the Persian delegation. The artillery in the Gulf is just the muscle. This courtroom is the actual execution chamber. The British government formally escalates the dispute to the League of Nations. I am tracking the paper trail of their primary demand, the absolute enforcement of the 1921 Darcy concession under international law. They are not asking for a compromise. They are demanding the total submission of a sovereign treasury back into the corporate fold. It is a brilliant, cynical maneuver. You force your victim into a legal arena where you wrote the fundamental rules of engagement. This is the anatomy of a rigged casino. From the perspective of the archivist, the transcripts reveal a suffocating reality. The League of Nations is essentially an exclusive club built by colonial powers to protect colonial assets. When you walk into their courtroom, you are not seeking justice. You are stepping into a jurisdictional trap. How do you win a legal battle when the judge, the jury, and the prosecution all share the exact same financial beneficiaries? The legal historian recognizes the fatal flaw in a direct confrontation. If the Persian delegation argues about unfair profit margins or stolen wealth, they lose. The law does not care about morality or poverty. It only cares about the binding signature on the document. I am analyzing the defensive strategy forming across that polished wooden table. The host nation realizes they cannot attack the terms of the contract. They have to attack the fundamental validity of the paper itself. I have located the official defense protocol submitted to the Geneva Tribunal. The Persian legal team bypasses the economic theft entirely. Instead, they argue that the 1901 concession is fundamentally null and void. Their evidence is historical and brutal. They testify the original document was signed under severe duress by a corrupt, utterly defunct royal dynasty. It was a predatory transaction executed decades prior to the establishment of their modern constitutional government. This is a spectacular legal paradox. They are trying to retroactively invalidate a monopoly by disowning the ghosts of their own dead rulers. If this scale of geopolitical hacking blows your mind, hit the like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments if you think a modern nation could pull off a legal stunt like this against today's global corporations. We're watching a desperate attempt to sever a legal bloodline, and the implications are absolutely terrifying for Wall Street. But the British syndicate is heavily fortified against this exact defense. I'm turning the pages of their counterclaim. Corporate lawyers dismantle the sovereignty argument with cold, administrative precision. Under international law, a state assumes the debts and contracts of its predecessors. You cannot simply reboot your government and delete your liabilities. The paper trail is continuous. The debt survives the death of the monarch. The trap remains securely locked around their economy. As an investigator tracing the transaction history, the deadlock is absolute. The League of Nations is methodically preparing to rule in favor of the empire. I am reading the diplomatic cables. The verdict is a foregone conclusion. If the ruling comes down, the warships stationed in the Persian Gulf will have the ultimate international mandate to open fire and seize the Abadan refinery by force. The legal fiction is about to become a kinetic reality, authorized by the highest court on earth. The smell of old paper in this Geneva library is the scent of impending doom. The host nation is trapped in a paradox of their own making. By burning the contract, they triggered a tribunal they cannot possibly survive. Every argument they present is absorbed and neutralized by the massive, self-serving bureaucracy of international law. You cannot out-litigate the entity that literally printed the legal dictionary. They need a weapon that bypasses the courtroom entirely. I am filtering the archive for anomalies. The historian's eye is looking for the glitch in the code, the one blind spot in the British legal armor. The Empire has secured the geographic territory, they have secured the military advantage, and they have secured the judicial precedent. But in their arrogance, they have overlooked the most fundamental vulnerability of any contract. A binding agreement requires two explicitly defined, universally recognized entities to exist simultaneously. Follow the logic of the paperwork. The syndicate poured all their resources into defending the clauses, the percentages, and the timeline. But I'm looking at the very top of the original Darcy concession document, zooming in on the header. The weakness is not in the fine print. The vulnerability is hiding in plain sight, right there in the title of the parties involved. The entire multi-billion-dollar legal gridlock hinges on a single, externally imposed word. The legal historian feels the methodical thrill of the impending discovery. The British built an impenetrable fortress around the idea of legal continuity. But what if you do not attack the continuity of the debt? What if you attack the actual identity of the debtor? If you cannot win the game by the established rules, you have to fundamentally alter the board. You have to find a way to legally vanish from the international registry without ever leaving your geographic borders. The solution is not going to come from the polished wooden tables of Geneva, nor from the gunboats idling in the Gulf. The ultimate geopolitical hack is brewing in a smoke-filled room back in Tehran, hidden inside ancient dictionaries and forgotten etymology. I am closing the League of Nations transcripts. The direct legal battle is lost, but the shadow war of corporate identity is just beginning. The syndicate is about to realize that you cannot sue a ghost. I am stepping away from the deadlocked legal tribunals of Geneva. The direct confrontation was a suicide mission designed to fail. But the real strategy is not playing out under the bright lights of the League of Nations. It is happening in a smoke-filled diplomatic backroom in Tehran late at night, where the true weapon is being forged in absolute secret. The legal historian traces a finger across a massive wooden table covered in faded maps and heavy historical dictionaries. The air is thick with the methodical thrill of an impending systemic collapse. We are not looking for a military strategy. We are conducting a forensic audit of antiquity, hunting for a structural flaw in the adversary's foundational paperwork. This brings us to the ultimate anomaly, the weaponization of linguistics. Consider the paradox sitting on this table. What happens to a multi-billion-dollar corporate monopoly when one of the primary signatories legally vanishes from the earth? You do not need to defeat an occupying army. if you can simply delete the jurisdiction they claim to occupy. The anomaly hides in the etymology. Look closely at the archives. The term Persia was never a domestic reality. It was an exonym, a convenient geographical label imposed by ancient Greek historians and eagerly adopted by Western imperial powers. It was a branding exercise, forced upon a sovereign people to make their territory easier to categorize and exploit. You have to understand the disconnect between the map and the territory. While London bankers traded futures based on this artificial label, the local population had never used it. For thousands of years, the people living on this soil had called their ancient land Iran. They possessed a true, unbroken national identity existing parallel to the corporate fiction. Now, cross-reference this linguistic divide with the paper trail of the empire. I am examining the original 1901 Darcy concession and the subsequent League of Nations treaty transcripts. Every single binding clause, every royalty agreement, and every territorial mandate is explicitly signed with the government of the entity recognized strictly as Persia. This is the exact moment the legal loophole reveals itself. The British syndicate believed they had placed an inescapable 60-year lock on a massive sovereign territory. But legally speaking, they had merely signed a contract with a ghost. They bound their entire imperial energy strategy to an artificial placeholder name that the host nation never officially claimed. The investigator knows that international law operates like a rigid algorithm. It does not process nuance, and it certainly does not run on assumptions. The tribunals in Geneva rely entirely on precise nomenclature and absolute bureaucratic continuity. A contract is only valid if the names on the ledger perfectly match the recognized entities in the global registry. Here is the strategic realization that alters the course of history. If the entity known as Persia is systematically scrubbed from that global registry, the foundational contracts tied to that specific name lose their legal anchor. They fall directly into a jurisdictional void. You cannot litigate a breach of contract against a debtor that ceases to exist. Think of it as a deliberate glitch introduced into the international legal code. By severing the connection between the physical land and the imposed corporate brand, the host nation isolates the parasite. The oil remains in the ground, but the paperwork granting the British access to it becomes utterly meaningless, pointing to a dead bureaucratic directory. It is a masterpiece of forensic evasion. The host government does not need to fire a single bullet, nor do they need to win the unwinnable argument in the Swiss courts. They simply need to reclaim their original, authentic name and demand that the rest of the world update their files. It is the ultimate administrative checkmate, executed entirely on paper. In this dimly lit room in Tehran, the architects of this hack are finalizing the documentation. They are weaponizing their own ancient heritage to exploit the rigid literalism of their oppressors. The dictionaries on this table are not academic texts. They are the blueprints for a sovereign heist. They are preparing to legally delete an entire nation from the map. The theoretical loophole has been identified, verified, and weaponized. The linguistic bomb is fully armed and ready to be deployed into the global logistical network. The syndicate in London is completely blind to the administrative shockwave heading their way. The era of Persia is officially over, and the Shadow War is about to enter its most devastating phase. The linguistic bomb leaves the Tehran back room and detonates across the global wire. Through the glass of a London telegraph office, you see ticker tape machines suddenly spewing yards of frantic queries. Postmasters in Washington and Paris are slamming red return to sender stamps onto massive piles of diplomatic pouches. The theoretical hack is now an active, aggressive deployment, tearing through the international logistical grid. Look closely at the paper trail flooding these mailrooms. Contracts, treasury checks, and high-level espionage briefs are bouncing off an invisible wall. The clerks are paralyzed, holding documents authorized by the highest levels of the British Admiralty, now completely useless. This is not a blockade enforced by dreadnoughts or artillery. This is an administrative quarantine, a systemic failure caused by a single, deliberate data corruption. The protocol change hits the network on a highly specific timestamp, March 21st, 1935. The date is not a random bureaucratic choice. It coincides precisely with Nowruz, the ancient Persian New Year. But this is not merely a cultural celebration. It is the execution date for a calculated legal maneuver. The host government issues a strict diplomatic circular to every foreign embassy operating within its borders. I tracked the transmission of this decree through the diplomatic archives. The text is brief, cold, and legally impenetrable. It mandates that from this exact second forward, the nation must immediately be addressed exclusively as Iran in all official correspondence, treaties, and corporate filings. The exonym is dead. The artificial corporate brand used to sign away the oil rights has been officially terminated by the host state. To the untrained eye, it looks like a simple rebranding, a matter of national pride. But as an investigator dissecting the global supply chain, you see the immediate weaponization of this term. The international legal framework is a rigid, literal machine. It does not tolerate ambiguity. By legally deleting the old name from the active global directory, the host government intentionally breaks every existing link to their sovereign territory. The enforcement is brutal in its bureaucratic simplicity. The decree dictates that any mail, diplomatic pouch, or corporate contract addressed to the defunct entity of Persia is instantly, legally rejected. It is marked invalid and physically returned to sender. This creates a massive, unprecedented administrative crisis for foreign powers attempting to communicate with their own heavily guarded assets on the ground. Follow the transaction failures cascading across the network. A British oil tanker cannot dock at the Abadan refinery because its customs clearance is addressed to a non-existent country. A syndicate bank in London cannot clear a £1 million transfer because the recipient ledger relies on a voided national identity. The daily operational flow of the world's first oil monopoly grinds to an absolute, screeching halt. The panic reaches across the Atlantic to the trading floors of Wall Street. Investors who thought they owned secure long-term bonds backed by Middle Eastern crude are suddenly holding paper that references a legal ghost. You cannot enforce a lien on an asset if the jurisdiction housing that asset has systematically erased its own coordinates from the international database. The physical oil is there, but the legal access is completely severed. Whitehall diplomats attempt to bypass the block, instructing their clerks to keep using the old name, treating the circular as a temporary nuisance. But they underestimate the airtight nature of the hack. Every communication they send is intercepted at the border and systematically bounced back. The host nation refuses to acknowledge any document, summons, or threat that does not bear the new, heavily authenticated sovereign marker. This is the brilliance of the administrative chokehold. Every day the British Empire refuses to update its paperwork. It bleeds capital. Cargo ships sit idle in the Persian Gulf, burning fuel while awaiting clearance that will never arrive. Refinery managers cannot process payroll. The mighty Anglo-Persian Oil Company, is effectively locked out of its own fortress, entirely neutralized by the strict enforcement of correct grammar. Think about the scale of this paralysis. The British Admiralty possesses the most lethal naval armada on the planet, positioned just off the coast, ready to enforce the Darcy concession with high explosive shells. But you cannot bombard a post office into accepting a letter. You cannot court-martial a foreign customs clerk for adhering to their own updated national registry. The military option is completely useless against red tape. I review the diplomatic cables from late March 1935, and the tone shifts from imperial arrogance to total administrative panic. The syndicate realizes they have been outplayed by a dictionary. The legal loop they built to trap the host nation has been inverted. The 60-year contract that guaranteed their monopoly is now a toxic asset, an orphaned file incapable of executing its core logistical directives. The global market watches in stunned silence as a supposedly primitive state successfully crashes the operating system of an empire. The logistical blockade is absolute, and the financial losses are compounding by the hour. The host nation has forced a total system reboot. To resume the extraction of the Earth's blood, the invaders will have to swallow their pride, pick up a pen, and legally acknowledge their own defeat. Tracking the financial shockwaves of this administrative blockade leads us directly from the Persian Gulf to a mahogany-paneled boardroom in the heart of London. Through the eyes of the forensic accountant, the scene is a study in corporate humiliation. Men in bespoke suits, who previously commanded dreadnoughts and dictated global energy policy, are now reduced to desperate clerks. They are systematically crossing out a single 6-letter word on stacks of legal letterhead. You are witnessing the absolute weaponization of bureaucracy. This is the exact moment a corporate titan is brought to its knees by a change in office stationery. To the investigator tracking the paper trail, the anomaly is glaring. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company cannot extract, transport, or sell a single barrel of crude because, according to the new global registry, their operating license is contracted with a phantom state. The host nation simply deleted their jurisdiction. To maintain any semblance of legal standing, the syndicate must submit to the new reality. I review the corporate filings from 1935, watching the reluctant surrender ink itself into the public record. The most powerful energy monopoly on Earth is forced to officially rebrand, stripping away its imperial namesake to become the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or AIOC. It is a total psychological and legal capitulation, permanently etched into the global financial ledger. Look closely at the transaction logs following this forced rebrand. The moment the new company seal hits the paper, the geopolitical deadlock shatters. The British government realizes that military force cannot compel a sovereign administrative apparatus to recognize a voided contract. They are losing millions in market capitalization with every day of the standoff. The corporate behemoth has no choice but to swallow its pride and crawl back to the negotiating table. This linguistic hack effectively wipes the slate clean. The original Darcy concession, a document that bound a nation for 60 years, is now dead paper. By forcing the British to negotiate under the newly authenticated sovereign framework of Iran, the host nation completely resets the power dynamic. The boardroom executives are no longer dictating terms to a conquered territory. They are pleading for access to a heavily fortified legal entity. The forensic audit of the resulting treaty reveals a staggering financial victory. Stripped of their legal leverage, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company is forced to sign an entirely new agreement. Iran successfully secures a guaranteed flat minimum payment of £750,000 sterling annually. This creates an unshakable floor for the national treasury, rendering the corporation's previous accounting tricks and artificial margin manipulations completely useless. But the true masterpiece of this negotiation lies in the profit restructuring. The forensic accountant notes a critical new clause. The host nation extracts a 20% share of the company's overall global profits. They are no longer just receiving a meager royalty on the crude oil pumped from their own soil. They have successfully, legally grafted themselves onto the corporate entity, taking a mandatory cut of the empire's worldwide downstream revenue. Track the capital flow before and after this single bureaucratic maneuver. By weaponizing a historical dictionary and enforcing strict compliance at the border, a bankrupt nation broke the world's most aggressive monopoly. They did not fire a single shot, yet they secured a massive transfer of sovereign wealth. The paper trail proves that the ultimate defense against predatory corporate extraction is not a standing army, but a flawless mastery of the international legal code. You are looking at the blueprint for modern sovereign resistance. This 1935 contract renegotiation becomes a terrifying precedent for Wall Street and Whitehall. If a supposedly primitive state can unilaterally rewrite the terms of global energy extraction by simply changing its name, no colonial contract is safe. The syndicate realizes their legal frameworks are fatally flawed, and the financial shockwaves of this single signature will echo for decades. The financial shockwaves of that single signature did not just echo through the 1930s. They built the architecture of the modern world. Look at the blinking lights of a modern server farm holding terabytes of corporate data. The heat of the processors mirrors the sweltering mudflats of the 1930 Abadan refinery. The extraction methods have evolved from crude oil to digital behavior, but the underlying legal game remains exactly the same. I have tracked the corporate lineage of this shadow empire, following the paper trail through a century of geopolitical laundering. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company did not vanish when its host nation weaponized the dictionary. It mutated. It rebranded one final time, shedding its geographic baggage to become the multinational behemoth you know today as BP, or British Petroleum. The ghost of that predatory 1901 contract is still pumping dividends into the portfolios of Wall Street. My final report on this heist reveals a chilling verdict. What happened in 1935 was not a diplomatic dispute. It was the birth of modern lawfare. We are looking at the weaponization of bureaucratic technicalities, where the international legal system itself becomes the theater of war. A sovereign nation realized that dreadnoughts and armies are useless against a well-placed jurisdictional void. They hacked the operating system of global commerce without firing a single bullet. You must strip away the romanticized illusions of history. We started this investigation looking at an ancient empire, assuming their survival depended on military strength or natural resources. But the evidence proves otherwise. National identity is not merely a cultural construct. It is a legally actionable shield, a firebreak capable of severing the most aggressive international contracts. If you do not own the definition of your own existence, you are simply collateral for someone else. I need you to apply this forensic lens to your own life. Right now, modern syndicates use the exact same legal frameworks to patent the water tables, copyright genetic codes, and harvest your digital footprint. They operate through impenetrable terms of service and offshore subsidiaries, creating an invisible Abadan refinery inside your smartphone. The ledgers are digitized, but the extraction of wealth relies on the exact same legal compliance they demanded a century ago. The inescapable conclusion of this file is that true power is never kinetic. Power is the administrative ability to define the parameters of reality. It is the authority to write the dictionary. The moment you accept a corporation's terminology, you concede your jurisdiction. When a country faked its own death and returned all mail addressed to Persia, they proved that you can bankrupt a global superpower simply by refusing to answer to the name they printed on your arrest warrant. We have deconstructed the ultimate geopolitical hack, but the shadow economy is constantly rewriting its contracts. If this forensic breakdown gave you a new perspective on how global power actually operates, hit the like button so we know this investigation is hitting the right targets. Subscribe to the channel to continue the research into these sovereign loopholes, and I want you to drop a comment below. What modern corporation do you think is currently running an invisible empire? The file on the 1935 sovereign hack is officially closed, but the machinery it exposed is fully operational. You are surrounded by a web of invisible contracts, written by entities that view you not as a citizen, but as a yield metric in a vast, unregulated concession. The international legal code is a predatory algorithm, and ignorance of its syntax is fatal. To survive the modern corporate state, you must become the relentless auditor of your own legal reality. The paper trail is undeniable. The empires of tomorrow will not conquer you with artillery. They will quietly acquire you through a subsidiary loophole while you are distracted. The only resistance left is absolute clarity. Read the fine print, question the terminology, and never surrender the right to define your own name. The case is closed, but your audit has just begun. Signing off.